The new V1 Import Entities API provides a quick method for customers to import their data into Integrity. For this demonstration, we're going to be utilising the CSV import of 3 different datasets. We're using CSV data as it's the most common data customers will have and can easily be exported from spreadsheets. The block CSV dataset contains 3 RFC 1918 defined network blocks. Within the dataset, the header line defines the position of the name, CIDR address, the default view of these blocks, the default domains of these blocks, and the data also contains a column to set a pre-existing user-defined field named block status. The network CSV dataset is larger, containing 4096/24 networks within the 172.16/12 block, which was defined in the block CSV dataset. The header line again defines the default required fields and also includes a column representing another pre-existing user-defined field called network status. The final addresses CSV dataset defines 253 IPv4 addresses within one of the prior networks defined in the network CSV dataset. The addresses CSV sets the IP address, name, MAC address, host name, a zone FQDN, and view. As this dataset contains both host name and zone FQDN data, it will also trigger host records to be added to the target zone. If we defined null fields for these columns, it would only add the IPv4 addresses and not trigger the host record additions. As the Import Entities API is a V1 API, it requires a BAM auth token to authorize, unlike the new basic auth mechanism utilized by the V2 RESTful API. Curl is used to get a BAM auth token for use in the requests header of our future Import Entities API calls. The first Import Entities call is to add the block CSV data to the address manager. The API requires a post request to the /services rest v1 import entities URL. The configuration option is set to import this data into an existing configuration named default, and the data type option is set to IPv4 block. The BAM auth token is set in the request header authorization field, and the form data is used to pass the data option, which defines the location of our block CSV data. After executing the API call, the output shows all 3 lines of the block CSV dataset were accepted, and the transaction occurred to add these lines to the address manager. Checking the address manager UI shows all 3 blocks have been added under the default configuration as expected. The second call to the Import Entities API is used to add the 4096 networks defined in the network CSV dataset. There are 2 changes made to the options we're passing. The first change is to change the data type to IPv4 network to indicate we're passing network data into the API. And the second change increases the maximum number of lines accepted to 5,000 as the dataset is larger than the default 1,000 lines. The form data is also changed to utilize the network CSV file. Adding this many network objects will take considerably longer than the blocks, but the output shows all 4096 networks were accepted and added. And checking the address manager, we can see all 4096/24 networks were indeed added as expected. The final dataset to import is the addresses.csv. The only option we need to change on this API call is to set the data type to IPv4 address. Upon return from the API, it shows that 253 addresses in the dataset were accepted and added to the address manager. The address manager shows that all 250 addresses added by the API are now present. The addresses CSV had values for the host underscore name and zone underscore FQDN columns, which trigger not only the addition of an IPv4 record, but also an accompanying host record in DNS. The Import Entities API has a number of required and optional parameters. The configuration parameter is a required field which sets which existing configuration to import the data into. The data type is a required parameter to tell the API which class of data is being imported. The optional commit option defines whether to immediately commit the import to the database or whether to just run validation. This is a useful option to pre-flight check that the data itself is valid before applying it. The max failures option is at default set to 0. This means all rows in the dataset will be committed to the database as a single transaction. This is by far the fastest option, but any failure in the dataset will roll back the entire transaction and hence all rows. But if max failures is greater than 0, each roll will be a single transaction. This is slower, but will keep running until the number of failures is greater than the max failures value. The user comment field is an optional parameter which can be used to apply a comment to the transaction shown in the address manager's transaction history. For example, you could comment CSV import of RFC 1918 blocks. The optional ignore field's value can be used to instruct the API it should ignore a specific field in the dataset being imported. For example, a customer may have a notes field in their dataset which is not valid for import. Any unknown fields in the data will automatically be assumed to be a user-defined field, which must already be defined at that infrastructure level for import to complete. The final required field is the form data, which defines which file is actually being imported. The prior Export Entities API introduced in Integrity 9.4 has had a minor enhancement to enable JSON to be outputted in a format more compatible with the new Import Entities API. The new option for import, when set to true, will ensure that the JSON output is compatible with import entities. In order to import the JSON output from export entities, the ignore fields parameter needs to be set to ignore ID and type fields, as both of these are unrequired. An ID is generated upon import, and we've already told the Import Entities API we're importing data of type IPv4 block. The only other adjustment to the Import Entities API is to change the file data to the JSON input file. We can see the API successfully imported the 3 RFC 1918 blocks into Integrity. Import Entities supports the bulk import of IPv4 blocks, networks, ranges, addresses and MAC addresses. Import Entities supports data files in either CSV, comma-separated values or NDJSON, new line delimited JSON format. The API supports the setting of pre-existing user-defined fields from within the import data, and the API requires administrator-level privileges to execute.